Peace, hello, greetings, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Food Literacy for All. And I think we're in week 6, right? We're studying along on this journey together. Thank you for joining us tonight. We have Niaz, Dorry, who will be presenting on their really beautiful work, our Revol-Ocean to take back our ocean and sea-based foods. Really excited to get into this presentation, and just per usual, we have some few housekeeping things for clarification. As I'm sure everyone is aware by now, we want to hold space for the tragedy that occurred at MSU, Michigan State University, last night. We want to hold all of those that have transitioned and are healing from critical injuries in our hearts and our spirits to the fullest extent. And we understand that people process things differently, and we want to allow folks to have the space that they need to heal and just digest this information and do whatever you need on a mental, emotional, physical, even spiritual level. And within that vein, week 5 participation points will be extended to this Friday, February 17th at 11:59 p.m. And all announcements and messages are posted on Canvas. So please refer to Canvas messages for updates and all of the important things that you need to know about the course. So of course, we cannot start our time together without expressing gratitude for the various sponsors that provide generous support. Dr. Cal White, the Residential College, Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the School for Public Health, the School for Environment and Sustainability, and the Department of American Culture. So big thanks to those that make this course that we're all engaged in right now very possible. And we are also a triad of team leaders, myself, who's a lecturer in SEAS, and I do food sovereignty, environmental justice work with Black farmers mainly in Michigan. And Dr. Walker, who is an assistant professor of Afro-American and African Studies, and also a professor in American culture. And Lily Feng Shapiro, who is the program manager for the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative. And we also have more team members who also contribute to making this class as dynamic and dope as it is. Megan Gross, who's a GSI, and Nayeski Hernandez, who's also another GSI. So please reach out to them with all of your course-related questions. They're very responsive, very on point. We could not continue on this course without them. Kimmy Vandwedge is the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative Coordinator, and Chris Taylor, our very helpful tech person who ensures that everything is flowing and moving smoothly throughout our online time together. Of course, this course is open and free to the public, and students who are University of Michigan students, please remember to make yourself known. Remember to attend with your University of Michigan email address, and community attendees. Of course, the readings are optional and always available and downloadable on the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative website. We do have a hashtag on Twitter, and poll questions for each class count towards attendance and participation points, and all classes are filmed and available on the website for your future viewing. As a quick reminder, please use the Q&A box for questions to add to address in class. And so the Q&A box is different from the chat box. Please take note of that. And because we use the Q&A box to keep track of the questions that we use to guide the discussion after our speakers present. And next week, we're really excited to have Ashley Gripper, who is a professor at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And she will be presenting on practices of care and relationship building a qualitative analysis of urban agriculture's impact on agency and well-being in Philadelphia. And the fast food for thought is coming up, and I'm sure many folks are familiar with this. This will be the 9th annual Fast Food for Thought, 10 tiny talks on 10 big topics in food and agriculture. And this will happen on March 14th, 6:30 p.m. in person. Please note this is in person. It's a free and open to the public event. We'll have an opening drum and dance performance, West African drum and dance performance by a local Detroit group. And the location is the Dana Building on campus, room 1040. And I think this is the last announcement, the Urban Agriculture Internship, where interns can go to local grassroots organizations in Detroit and Ypsilanti to work with farmers, farm leaders that are doing really dope work on the ground. There's an info session tomorrow from 6 to 7:30 p.m. And the location is the Michigan League, Michigan room on the 2nd floor. And I see Lily posting in the chat with more information about that. Oh, okay, this must be the final announcement. The MIFS conference, the Michigan Family Farms Conference, is coming up Saturday, February 25th. This is a really dynamic space for beginning small-scale culturally diverse farmers to network, learn, and build sustainable family farms. I attend as often as I can, usually every year. It's a very family-friendly space. There's children's activities. There's really workshops from all walks of or all areas of food systems, whether you're a grower or distributor, an educator, researcher, organizer. There are student tickets available for $10, and looks like there's a carpool sign up available, which is really nice. Hope that makes it accessible for some folks. And now I'm going to pass it over to Lily to introduce our speaker.
Hey, everybody. This is such an honor to have Niaz joining us here at Food Literacy for All, Niaz Dorry. And I just want to tell you that first, before class, I'm looking at the internet, I'm searching for what I can learn about Niaz aside from her bio. And I found this collection of just fascinating and rich headlines and terms that I am so excited to learn more about. So I'll share with you a few just to get a flavor of her work before I read her official bio. So some of the phrases and headlines I read were things like fishing for justice, who fishes matters, fishers and farmers taking back control of the food supply, fishing for local power, community-supported fisheries, stewards of the ocean commons, and ecologically responsible local fisheries. So now for the official bio is that for over 30 years, Niaz Dorry has been both a community organizer working on environmental, social, and economic justice issues, both on land and in the sea. And she has been deeply embedded with fisheries since 1994, which is when she moved to, we'll see if I say it right, to Gloucester, Massachusetts, which is the oldest settled fishing port in the US. And Niaz right away recognized the similarities between a family farmer's fight for more just and ecologically responsible land on the land-based food system and the similarities with community-based fishermen who are fighting to fix the broken sea-based food system. So she is the coordinating director of the Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance. And one of the first things that the Alliance did when Niaz took the helm was to also join the National Family Farm Coalition as its first non-farming member. So she's really making connections. And it sounds like those two organizations have now shared a shared leadership model, and Niaz is at the leadership of both organizations, further cementing that relationship and interdependence between the land and the sea. According to Time Magazine named Niaz the hero for the planet for her work with small-scale, traditional, and indigenous fishing communities to fight against the corporate takeover of the ocean and privatization of the marine environment and fishing rights. So I am so excited to learn more about these terms in your work. And with that, I will pass the virtual mic to you, Niaz. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Lily, for the kind introduction and for everybody to joining us. As everybody on our team and in our movement knows that I'm a crier, which is not a bad thing. And so as you were reading those headlines, I already got a little verklempt. So thank you for sharing all of that. And it's an honor to be with all of you. Although I am here in my capacity as the coordinating director of the North American Marine Alliance, we changed our name because the breadth of our work has grown beyond just this Northwest Atlantic region. And we now work across the continent. But I also serve as at NFFC as well. So the work of connecting our land food system and our seafood system is now embedded in everything I do. And but I think I want to back up for just a second before I dive into, no pun intended, dive into the fisheries work, because I think what brought me here is, I hope it's an important part of what has brought me here with all of you. As Lily mentioned, I've been doing community organizing most of my adult life. And I was working at Greenpeace in the early 90s as an environmental justice organizer in the toxics campaign, where we were fighting against pulp and paper mills in communities of color, or the world's largest toxic waste incinerator, where I ended up living in the community of East Liverpool for 2 years, fighting alongside the community in Ohio, or a pipeline, or whatever it is. It's an unnecessary technology that has been encroaching upon a community and standing with the community in a way that Greenpeace hasn't necessarily always done, which is to let the community lead. And so bringing that community organizing lens to the work was how we've operated at the time within the oceans, within the toxics campaign. Sorry, I'm still sniffling from those headlines. And then the ocean campaign approached me and asked me if I would consider working on fisheries and ocean issues. And at the time, all I could really think about was save the whales. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. It just, as a community organizer who's focusing on environmental justice issues, I couldn't see how I was going to be able to do this work. And then folks were giving me articles to read, and I was learning about history. And it didn't take long before the dime dropped, that this fight for the ocean and fisheries is actually no different than the fight for East Liverpool and for environmental justice in general. It was all about global movement of capital. And in the case of East Liverpool, the community was standing in the way of that global movement of capital. And in the case of fisheries, communities are standing in the way of the corporate domination of our ocean. And so that's really, once I could wrap my head around that and see the organizing potential, I was hooked. And I, as Lily mentioned, I'm sight unseen. I had read about this community, and it seemed like from a political, geographic, cultural, economic, historical, from a lot of different reasons, this place seems like where I should go and live as someone who works and organizes in fishing communities. And Lily, I laughed when you try to pronounce the name of this town, because I called a friend of mine and I said, I'm doing it, I'm switching campaigns and I'm moving to Gloucester. And he said, you know, first things first, we have to teach you how to pronounce the name of the town you're moving to. So here I am almost 30 years later here in Gloucester. And for the first few years, I really spent a lot of my time fishing. I had a lot of strikes against me in many ways. I was a woman, and an Iranian American woman, a Muslim woman, a vegetarian woman, somebody who worked for Greenpeace. So from the fishing community standpoint, there was a lot of reasons not to want me around. And so I felt that, and also I was ignorant when it came to fishing issues. So it felt really important to learn all that I could on their turf. So I spent a lot of time on fishing boats along the coast, learned a lot. And it was one of the other times when this connection between land food and seafood and the similarities between community-based fishermen and family farmers really came home to roost. You're standing on a deck of the boat, and the conversations that are happening give you an insight into who folks are, what values they bring, what is the end they want to meet, and it really gave me the picture that I needed to be able to wrap my head around this work. So that's a little bit of background about me. And then after leaving Greenpeace and stepping into the NAMA role in late 2007, 2008, one of the first questions I kept getting asked when I was trying to sell this idea that who fishes actually does matter, and we need to pay attention to the source of our seafood. I often got this, well, what does that have to do with anything? What does sea have to do with it? And our little heart got moved in the technology transport, but I was given some props to stealing Tina Turner's line. It is Valentine's Day after all. So what's sea got to do with it? And the it being what's sea got to do with food, with equity, with justice, and fill in the blank. Because most folks, especially from the environmental community and those who felt like they already knew what it meant to subscribe to the sustainable seafood agenda by following the red, yellow, green lists or getting seafood that's certified by you name it, whomever, that they had it figured out and that nothing else really mattered. And the more I began to do this work, the more I really realized it really does matter, especially for the food system activists, to pay attention to our seafood system, because the problems that we've been facing on land are mirrored on the water. The solutions that you all have been coming up with on land are being mirrored on the water. And unless you're going to stop eating California rolls and sea salt on your food, or using sea sponges, or feeding sea animals to your farm animals, or using sea-based compost on your farm, sea's got everything to do with food justice and food access and our ability to have an equitable food system. So that kind of became my mission in some ways, to convince others that sustainable seafood guides are a good start, but they don't go deep enough. We need to go further in our quest for a real just seafood system. And one of the first things that I was hearing when I entered this is what I now see as a very much a false narrative, which is there are too many boats catching too few fish. And on the surface, that makes sense. All right, you've got a lot of boats out there. If you've got a finite body of water, you can't have that many boats out there, right? That makes sense in some ways. But again, if you go a little bit deeper, and I started to really focus on those two words, too many and too few. And after ruminating a lot on those 4 words in this sentence, I started to really have these images of where else have I heard this? I've heard this in the food system. There are too many small farms, and they're not efficient enough, and they're not growing enough food, and we need to deal with that. And that conversation really started in probably a few decades ago. And the neoliberal solutions to this too many boats catching too few fish on the fishing side is consolidate the fishing industry and reward the most efficient. And of course, the definition of efficiency they use in this case is an antiquated one, in my opinion, which is whoever catches the most at the lowest cost of production. Again, these are very similar to struggles on land. Consolidate the farming industry, farmland ownership, and reward the most efficient, which means whoever can grow the most fence row to fence row at the lowest cost of production. So all of these things were just ringing familiar bells in my head. And then I realized, oh yeah, that's what they call the Green Revolution. That's what they call themselves. And they said, well, that's what we need to do to feed the hungry in the world. And who are some of the players that emerged and really started to take the helm at the Green Revolution? The Unilevers of the world, Cargills of the world, Tysons and ADMs and Conagra and Caterpillars. And I want to focus a little bit on 2 of these players in particular. Actually, we'll do that in the next slide. So then I'm thinking, all right, it's a Green Revolution. This all sounds familiar. These players are in there. So what am I now hearing from the seaside? They call themselves the Blue Revolution. Lo and behold, there is something happening here that seems very familiar. And who are the players of the Blue Revolution? We got the Unilevers of the world, and Cargill, and Tyson, and ADM, and Conagra Foods, and Caterpillar. So what does that tell us? And to give you a couple of little stories about each of these players that I mentioned in the last slide, when I first started working on fisheries issues was when one of the first scenarios to privatize the rights to fish, much like we privatized land, was put into action here in the US. It was for a fishery called the Alaska halibut and sablefish fishery. Anybody who likes halibut, you may relate to this. So those fishing rights went up for sale, even though we were told that these are not privatization schemes. These are really just ownership equals stewardship. People who own these rights are going to be better caretakers of it. And the public still owns the ocean commons. So the first set of rights go up in bankruptcy court. It's like ding, 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 right off the bat, we know these are property rights. Otherwise, why would it end up in bankruptcy court? So I know that we have some multiple choice questions later on, but I kind of snuck one in here. This is another one. I'm curious to know if folks can tell me who was the company amongst the 6 who literally walked into the bankruptcy court with a briefcase full of cash to buy those first set of fishing rights that went up for sale. You can put that in the chat if you want, and we can kind of see who got it right. And then the second story, while you're thinking about that, is Tyson. At the same time, I heard that Tyson was getting into fishing and that we're particularly interested in the factory trawler fleet of Alaska who catches pollock. So they bought 5 factory fishing operations, and that caught my eye, caught my attention. So I ended up buying 2 shares of Tyson just to keep an eye on them. And for those of you who may not know this, as a strategy, there's a lot of good work that you can do within the shareholder advocacy world with organizations like As You Sow and others. So I bought these shares of Tyson, and the first annual report I got was the cover said, "We're not just chicken anymore," and they were really boasting about their foray into the fishing world. Fast forward to 1999, and they had done such a poor job in fishing that the taxpayers literally had to buy them out at the cost of $5 million within a bill called the American Fisheries Act. The first annual report that came out of Tyson after that was, "We're back to our core strengths." Of course, no mention of the fact that they didn't know what they were talking about. So I just sort of did a quick scan of who folks thought came in here and bought those fishing rights. And you're all wrong, by the way. It's okay. I don't expect everybody to know this, but it's Caterpillar. So Caterpillar is the entity that came and bought those fishing rights. And the rest of these folks, Unilever, Cargill, ADM, and Conagra, keep your eyes on those because we're going to come back to them in a couple of minutes. So what are some of the visions of the Green Revolution that unfortunately we're all familiar with? These are some of the images that accompany that so-called revolution. And where does their so-called product go? In the McDonald's and Burger Kings and Gordon's and Red Lobsters and Long John Silver's of the world. And of course, we're told that this is okay because this is what affordable food is all about. People can go here and buy a $1 burger. I don't know if I need to talk about the wrong underlying assumptions in that conversation, but we will if you like to. So here are some of the images of the so-called Blue Revolution. To me, they just are strikingly similar to what we saw on land. This is a fishing net on a factory fishing trawler in Alaska. That's actually, you only are seeing a fraction of it. It's they can be up to about a couple of football field long. These are just, again, these are hooks used. And a lot of people romanticize hook fishing because it's relatively benign, but in an industrial setting, you can industrialize even something as benign as a hook and line fishing operation. So this is what the Blue Revolution brings us. And there are a lot of victims of the Blue Revolution when it comes to the marine animals itself, but 2 of the ones that are particularly heartbreaking for me are shrimp and salmon. There's a long story about shrimp that I won't get into all of it. I'm happy to dive into it a little bit more. That really digs into the issues of poverty, the issues of land rights, even though these are farmed at sea, the issues of food access, the issues of economic justice, not only here in this country, but around the globe, where roughly 3 to 4 billion people live in coastal communities, and particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, shrimp farming has jeopardized their basic way of life. This is a picture from the mid-90s where community activists in Ecuador were fighting against a shrimp farm that was encroaching upon their rights. And there was a massacre where the security opened fire on the protesters. This is a photo taken the day after where the security was guarding the shrimp farm against so-called agitators. This is what their product looks like, and I don't like that word, just to be clear. And then the other is salmon, and this is a industrial salmon farm, offshore salmon farm. I think it's an offshore salmon farm. Don't quote me on that one. I should have checked, but this is essentially what they look like. And I've included a couple of slides about salmon, and you can find more about this in our report called The Footprint of Farm Seafood and Aquaculture, because salmon seems to be the one fish that people seem to want to eat regardless of the consequences. And most of the salmon that is farmed is actually Atlantic salmon. And when we hear the argument that, yeah, we got to farm it because we can't kill them all on land, I mean, in the wild, well, guess what? We already killed Atlantic salmon because of human interventions that weren't appropriate for the species, building dams, deforestation, polluting their waterways, and many more have led to now an endangered species status for Atlantic salmon. So almost all the salmon you eat is going to be farmed salmon, and it's going to be farmed Atlantic salmon. And there's consequences to that. And I encourage you to dive further into the footprint report. Here's a little bit more about salmon aquaculture. On top of all of this, there's also a lot of work afoot by a couple of companies, one called AquaBounty, to actually not only pursue fish farming on an industrial scale, what I call CAFOs on the water, factory fish farms, but taking it a step further and introducing genetic modification into this. We have a project that we are an ally with called the Block Corporate Salmon Campaign that's led by Indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest, very much focused on the issue of addressing the impact of genetically engineered salmon and industrial fish farms in particular, not only Indigenous communities, but elsewhere. And some of their operations are actually now being, they call it land-based. So it's sort of like CAFOs on land, but for seafood, for marine animals. So these, and shrimp and salmon are popular species. So your first multiple choice question is, what do you think are the top 5 marine animals eaten in the US? And I don't know how much time folks have to vote, but we'll give you a couple of minutes to look it over. Shrimp, tilapia, squid, oysters. Interesting. Okay. Well, good choices, interesting choices. And I have to say that even though this was a multiple choice question, really when you start asking, depending on who you ask this question and what region they're in, the answers might be different. But generally speaking, shrimp, salmon, pollock, tuna, tilapia, and catfish sort of jockey for the same space. So shrimp, salmon, tilapia, pollock, and catfish, and what was the other one that I mentioned? Tuna. So pollock, primarily because it's not only in every little Nemo is safe, yes, and I'll close chat because you guys are going to distract me. Pollock, because it's in almost every burger that you get, any fish burger that you get. It's also in every imitation seafood that you eat. Imitation seafood is called surimi, and it's essentially pollock literally beaten into a pulp and with flavoring and coloring added to it to be fake crab or fake shrimp or fake whatever that they want to turn it into. So that's one of the reasons why it occupies such, and that's Alaska pollock, just to be clear. There's also Atlantic pollock, which is a whole different species, and it's not used in that. So I should have been clear and put Alaska pollock in there. Sorry if I tricked anybody in the test. So as I was mentioning, these are sort of the places where you find their stuff. So with all that information, with these restaurants, all of them saying we're using sustainable pollock, which actually the factory trawl fleet of Alaska is called a sustainable fishery by one certification company called the Marine Stewardship Council, which is essentially nothing more than a pay-to-play program. So if you can pay for the certification, chances are you're going to be certified. And yet there's a lot of reasons why the certification of a fishery like pollock, Alaska pollock, should have been challenged but they have a lot of money. They're a powerful player, and they got their certification. And then there are all these lists, the red, yellow, green lists, and you buy something because it's on the green list, and a couple of years later, it ends up on the red list. And I will tell you, one of the biggest qualms, the biggest things that grate at me with these seafood lists is the level of privilege they represent. The idea to say, don't eat this, when there are communities where that privilege does not exist, when places where maybe the only thing they can eat is what you're considering to be on the red list. So a lot of these certifications don't address some of our core values when it comes to justice, equity, and access. So with all that in mind, how do you decide what seafood to eat? We decided, all right, we're not going to badmouth the certifications too much. Give credit where credit is due. They've gotten a lot of us to think critically about seafood. And essentially, we think they're good enough to get you thinking, but not good enough when it comes to meeting some of the core values that at least we have and we think we might share with a lot of you here. So instead, we have come up with our own sustainable seafood guide. Instead of telling you what species to eat, we're asking you to focus on what values are important to you. The same values that you have been applying to your chickens and pigs and lettuce and tomatoes, we're asking you to bring those values to your seafood purchasing decisions. And there was a link on here, which I think in the transition it got lost. But if you go to our website, you can find the Sustainable Seafood Guide. And I did notice a couple of our staff are on the webinar, so maybe they'd be kind enough to put the link in the chat for us. So which takes us, so now you have a guide and you can maybe think about what you're going to eat, but then who gets to eat? And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the guides tend to be very much serving those who already have a lot of other options. Even a concept like community-supported fisheries, which we piloted, we're very proud of that work that started this whole movement that has now become the community-supported fisheries movement. You can go to localcatch.org to find a seafood operation somewhere near you if you put in your zip code that matches your values. But it's really important to us to also make sure that those who need seafood most get to eat seafood, get access to it. That may be nutritional needs, it may be cultural, maybe historical, maybe religious, maybe economic. But it's really important for us to make sure that seafood isn't relegated to the food of the privileged and frankly, primarily white rich communities. There's a lot of diverse communities who haven't had access to seafood because of all the policies that have been put into place. And there's some really good projects that have emerged over the last couple of years that have addressed this whole issue of equity. One of them being this community fishery model in Philadelphia called Fishadelphia, which I encourage you to take a look at. But then there's operations happening in indigenous communities to try to catch and sell directly to their communities first. The idea here is to prioritize feeding our communities first, not to be xenophobic to say nobody else needs to eat but my community, but to look at our seafood system in a concentric circle of, much like we should do in our land food system or our food system in general. We grow, we catch, we raise what we need to feed our communities. What's left goes one circle out and one circle out and one circle out. And the global economies of scale that feed multinational corporations should get the crumbs. They shouldn't get the cream off the top, which is what they typically do now. And when we challenge status quo around this issue of who gets to eat and how you decide, they tell us, well, our job is to compete in the global economies of scale. The blue revolution we talked about earlier. Well, I'm not shy to say our job is to dismantle the global economies of scale. And those are the kind of models that we want to pursue. And then we finally get to the question of, so all of this is in place, who gets to fish? I remember one of my first meetings that I went to in fisheries back in the mid-90s. There are these meetings called marine fisheries. God, I hated them so much, I've even forgotten the name. Regional Fishery Management Councils. And I remember being in the audience and then getting up to testify in this very intimidated setting where I was arguing that the scale of operation, the fishing communities should really be given preference when it comes to policies. And there was, and I often try to stay away from calling out organizations, but in this case, I don't shy away. It was a member of an organization called the Environmental Defense Fund, who's actually been at the forefront of pushing for neoliberal policies on the ocean. And his comments in response to my testimony was, a dead fish is a dead fish. It doesn't matter who killed it. And in that moment, I had this thought of, oh my God, that's like telling me a dead pig is a dead pig. It doesn't matter who killed it. And the images of pigs being held in captivity and what happens to them and how, whether and how do we honor them in life and in death. And the same with the fish. That was one of the moments where I found myself really changed in this conversation around who gets to fish. And it's also really important to note that who gets to fish is also rooted in some of the racial injustices that we're facing right now. And there's a lot of fishing communities, indigenous communities, that got displaced from their fishing right at the time of colonization and are still to this day fighting for fishing rights. The fish wars in Pacific Northwest continue even today along some fishing communities. Here in the Northeast, the Passamaquoddy had to fight for rights to the glass eel fishery after Fukushima because the search for eels for sushi became so hot that suddenly non-indigenous fishermen got wind of this fishery up in the Northeast, and the price of the rights to fish skyrocketed, and the local agencies did everything they could to push the indigenous communities out and get the non-fishing community, the non-indigenous communities in, because the price was about $1,000 a pound for these tiny little eels that were getting taken overseas to be kept in pounds till they reached market weight to be brought to the sushi market. The Gulagichi community, the Black watermen in the Southeast, are still facing discrimination and lack of access to essential needs. They are actually being bullied by some of the white fishermen in their community, even to this day. One of those folks who has been facing the backlash actually ended up being invited to share the Farm Aid stage this last year in North Carolina to talk about his struggles, Captain Charlie Abner. And then, of course, there's just all the other common denominators that the people who we think should fish have with family farmers. Their scales of operation are appropriate. They are connected to a community. They care about who they're feeding. As Jim Goodman, the board president of National Family Farm Coalition, says, they keep telling me I got to feed the world, but the world can feed itself if we let it. And one of those things we need to let the world do is have access to fishing rights, have access to land rights, to seeds, to clean water, to facilities and infrastructure. And that is how we get to have the right people to fish. And then when it comes to deciding who fishes, what matters? For us, the scale of operation matters. Is the scale of operation in harmony with the scale of the environment within which they're fishing? What's the purpose of this operation, whether it's a aquaculture facility or wild capture? Is it to enter that global economies of scale, or is it to literally feed their communities and the concentric circles that grow out of that? And who owns it? Is the ownership within the community, or is the ownership by the multinational corporations who have been edging their way into our policy systems? And this is actually, I've put in this picture in the Who Gets to Fish because I saw this picture early on in my work in fisheries. And again, it was one of those captivating moments for me. I could replace some of the words in there. Our fishermen are not criminals. I could replace it with our farmers are not criminals. Save farming jobs in rural communities. Stop cheap farm product imports now. All of these just, I felt like I was living in parallel universes with just two different food systems, and they were all facing the same problems. And I should note that a lot of the solutions are transferable as well. Not all, but a lot. And as these folks were fighting and bringing up these issues, fighting against consolidation and corporate takeover, there was another editorial that ran in 1994 in a fishing publication. This is when the privatization of fishing rights was being introduced here in the Northeast. And there was these factory fishing operations on the horizon. Georges Bank is a major fishing grounds here. All the small boats, I think the picture kind of speaks for itself. And the small boats were essentially saying, as soon as we're gone, these guys are waiting in the wake, literally, to come and take over the fisheries and our rights to fish. So who gets to fish? And this is your second or I forget, I lost count. Your next multiple choice question. Knowing that currently there's these neoliberal policies to capture the rights to fish, that's what the scenario is couched within. You're a red snapper fisherman, you just came home, you got paid $5.50 a pound for your red snapper. Because the quota is owned by someone else, you got to essentially pay rent for that quota. How much rent did you pay to the sea lords for the rights to fish before you even left the dock? Dying to know what your answers are to this one. Yep, $4.50. Majority of you got it right. So to put this in perspective, the boat made $1 on their catch, $1 a pound on their catch. And one of the other similarities that fisheries have, our seafood system has with our land food system, is the real cost of production is not accounted for. This $5.50 doesn't come far enough in and of itself to cover the cost of the boat, paying for their crew, paying for your livelihood, your home, your health insurance, clothes for your kids, whatever else is in there, much like land food systems. I have spent a lot of time thinking about our dairy farmers and how little they get paid, and all the costs that are not taken into account by USDA's definition of cost of production. And essentially, by the time the fisherman leaves the dock or the farmer has not even started their production, really, they're in the red. And that's one of the consequences in the fishery sector of this privatization and corporate takeover of the ocean. So one of the policy solutions we've been asking for is for these privatization schemes to be stopped. First of all, moratorium on any new policies like this. And second is that cost of production, both for farmers and fishermen, should incorporate the real cost of production, so that farmers, fishermen, ranchers are getting paid enough, living wage, so that they can live lives with dignity as well, so that they can pay their workers equitable wages and dignified wages. The ripple effects of that old, candlestick maker, that whole thing goes a long way when people are paid their cost of operation. And there's another part of cost of operation, both in our land food system and our seafood system, that I just don't want to go without saying here. The emotional well-being of people. And over the last few years, we have all really seen the vivid signs of that distress in rural America. It's shown up as racist backlashes. It's shown up in violent ways. It's shown up in suicides in rural communities. At the root of most of that is this economic injustice in our food system. And this is your last multiple choice question built on the last one. Here in New England, everybody knows New England cod. It's been both the subject of controversy and also a lot of people like it in fish and chips. So the fishing rights for cod, curious who you think owns more rights than anybody else in New England. This is the rights to fish, which means once they own it, they become the sea lords that we were talking about in the last question and get to lease it out to fishermen who are actually getting out on the water. The quota owners don't have to be people who fish. In fact, most of them, I'm giving away the answer here. I'll stop. People have been doing their homework. Yes, private equity firms. In fact, there is one private equity firm. If those of you who haven't, for those of you who haven't seen it, there is a couple of investigative pieces that came out last year by ProPublica exposing the ownership of most of the ownership of the New England groundfish fishery by a company called Revol Partners, who is actually owned by it's a private equity firm of the richest family in the Netherlands. And they have now become the biggest owner of the private equity of fishing rights here in the Northeast, specifically for what they call the groundfish complex, which includes cod. I wish it was Poseidon first, community-based fishermen next. I'm not even that supportive of some of the nonprofit organizations that are owning fishing rights, mostly because a lot of them are looking at it as much like we're seeing in land ownership by some nonprofit agencies where they're holding it and not necessarily making it available to farmers. We're seeing the same pattern with fishing rights. And so there's something to be said for making sure that first and foremost, the ocean and anything that lives within it remains a public commons. And that is where our friend Poseidon comes into the picture. So here we are. Hopefully giving you a lot to think about, not only in terms of what's wrong, but hopefully also, although we didn't get into it that much, in terms of what we can do. Some of the things we can do, and that's why we're inviting you to join the Revol-Ocean, is to join us in asking for some of the policy changes that are afoot. Just last week, we joined the NAMA and the National Family Farm Coalition members joined each other in a fly-in to DC to meet with members of Congress, asking for changes to policies both on land and at sea that marginalize small and mid-scale fishing communities, that prevent us from having access to food, especially for the communities that have most need for it, and essentially make our land and seafood more of a commodity situation than a food system situation. So, and all of those policies are on various websites. With the NAMA website, you can go to the Catch Share Coalition part of our website to learn more about the fight against privatization of the ocean. You can also learn about what Block Corporate Salmon is doing and our partners at Don't Cage Our Ocean Coalition are doing against factory fish farming. On the NFFC side, you can learn about our dairy policy, you can learn about our land access policies and much more. And so you can join both of those calls to action from both organizations, because whether you're fighting for the land food system or the seafood system, the reason we're in this shared leadership model and the reason why we feel the reason the shared leadership model is so important, because there's common denominators between our land food system and our seafood system. If we ask for equity on land, those of us who work at sea can take advantage of that and leverage that to ask for equity when it comes to our seafood system. If we ask for a stop to privatization and consolidation in the seafood sector, those of us with a foot on land can take that and leverage it to ask for a stop to consolidation and corporate takeover of our land food system. So this is a revolution, not just in its marine world, but also it's in its land world, and we hope that we can work with you in the future. Our staff, I saw some of them on here. We hope that you will sign up for the newsletters. They can follow up with some of the questions that I might not be able to answer, because frankly, I'm not the best answerer to a lot of our questions. So I'm glad they're here. And these are some of the websites that I mentioned that you can go to learn more about the work. NAMA's website, the local catch for seafood buying purposes. Don't Cage Our Oceans is about the work to stop factory fishing operations. Slowfish is another entity that we work with collaboratively, and of course NFFC. And NFFC has a project called Disparity to Parity Project that really gets to the heart of issues around equity, particularly as they're rooted in the concept of parity. And I saw that in the chat, Fanny put in the link for Block Corporate Salmon, which is hosted by Uprooted and Rising. So I hope I've left you with some good food for thought in terms of your seafood choices and the way you can navigate those waters. And I hope that we can see you in the future in one of these platforms in fighting for seafood justice alongside our land food partners. Thank you again for inviting me, Lily and Shakara and Jessica and others.
Thank you so much, Niaz, for that. I love the note that we're ending on, the collaboration between land and sea and the common denominator of food, which certainly echoes a lot of what we've been thinking about this term. So as a reminder, don't forget to put your questions in our Q&A box. I'll start with our first question, which asks, in seafood restaurants, how does the process from dock to restaurant play a role in this topic? I'm assuming that's a kind of farm to table kind of twin. So the process from dock to restaurant, how does that play a role?
Yeah, it's a really important role, because in some cases, The more innovative restaurants and the more kind of radical in all the good ways restaurants are willing to do things that others aren't willing to do, akin to when restaurants were willing to take vegetables that maybe the average person didn't know what to do with. Some restaurants are being creative and are taking risks. You know, they are buying a whole fish and taking responsibility to break it down in their shop and cooking the whole fish and teaching people that parts are parts. Is what I always say. There's no bad parts to an animal as long as you know what to do with it. People always ask me, how can I fillet a fish? Well, I'll teach you how to unfillet a fish, because there's a lot of value in the whole fish. And so in the early days of the community fisheries, the CS Community Supported Fisheries Movement, which started in about 2007, 2008, which is something we obviously stole and adapted from the community supported agriculture model. And a new model emerged out of that, was called the restaurant supported fisheries. And so restaurants were buying shares through the CSF movement to actually get whole fish. And the other part of it that's really important that chefs can play a big role in is be open to whatever species the ocean has to offer you. This idea of cherry picking what we want to eat, and that's why those top 10 species that I had on there are problematic, because we all go to those top 10 species because we're told that's what you should eat. And that's a marketing scheme. It's not an ecological situation. And so suddenly those species become no longer available. They're on the red list, and who's first to be blamed? The fishermen, when it's actually the marketing systems who put those things on our plates. So be open to whatever the ocean gives us. It is a fish eat fish world. It's not a magic. It's not a magic trick that a net only brings up a cod. That is a selective marketing choice people are making because people are telling them, I'll only take your cod. But there's other species that come up in that net. And chefs can be at the forefront of being experimental, being open to the idea of embracing whatever fruits of the ocean we can get our hands on.
Yeah, thank you for making that connection between culinary innovation and how these kind of trend into the mainstream. Okay, so our next question is, what do small fishermen or fishing communities do to steward the waters they fish, in your experience? What does a community look like that is centered around sustainably farming in the ocean? What's similar and different in your experience from land farming and those kinds of community values?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'll just want to clarify one thing to better understand the question. Part of the question is, what is a community that's sustainably farming in the ocean looks like? Are they specific, as a questioner actually specifically asking what is a sustainable aquaculture system looks like? Or is it just the question that was written in an odd way? Because they're two different questions in some ways.
Yeah, it's kind of a two-parter. The first one is, what do fishing communities do to steward the waters that they fish? And the second one is, what does a community look like that is centered around sustainably farming in the ocean? So
okay,
a little similar, but yeah.
Okay, so a fishing community that is stewarding the ocean, the number one thing that they look like, it's not that different from a land food community that is taking care of their farm looks like. They are vibrant. There are infrastructures in place for them. The young people are staying in the community and taking over the next generation of the businesses. The small businesses that feed them and fuel them and equip them are there in their communities. Their processing facilities are there in their communities. They don't have to transport their animals 800 miles away, somewhere out of sight, out of mind. Their product, and I don't like using that word yet, I keep using that word, what they catch isn't taken away, exported somewhere, processed somewhere by people who are not getting paid a living wage, re-imported back into this country, put on shelves at prices we can't afford. And so there's a lot that shows up in the feel of the community, in the resources that are available in the community, in the percentages of young people that are staying in the community, with the wealth that's staying in the community. So when you see that, when you walk into the community and you feel that, you see that and it's palpable, you know that these are folks who are actually paying attention to how they interact with the ocean, and they're demanding system changes to keep that vibrancy there. It is, there's a fisherman here, and there's stewardship kind of shows up in ways, again, people who farm might relate to this. The fisherman here, Niaz San Filippo, many years ago, I went out on his boat, and his boat is docked in a place right across from a bank. And he said, there used to be a chair or a tree, I can't remember what kind of tree it was, in front of that bank. And who taught him how to fish was his grandfather, who used to say, you cannot take your boat out until that tree starts to bloom. And so he would say, all right, well, this is probably some old tales. I'm going to take my boat out. And he did, and he wasn't successful. So he came back, and he went back to the ways that he was told how to fish. And so that culture is a sign of a well-stewarded fishing community in my mind. The food culture, the recipes that are passed along, the ways of harvesting and processing that are passed along, you can feel that when you're in a community that's taking care of itself and taking care of the body that's feeding it, really, which is the ocean out there. When it comes to fish farming, it's really about, or aquaculture, because it's not all aquaculture is about finfish. We have oysters, we've got clams, there is seaweed that people are growing. There's a project in Alaska being run by Native Conservancy that's focused on making sure the next land grab isn't around seaweed rights in Alaska, and that Indigenous people have the right to grow seaweed and provide for their communities. Those are all forms of aquaculture and fish farming or seafood farming, if you will. And for us, the right way to do it is it has to be in balance with the ecosystem. The ownership needs to be community-based. The ocean waters and column and the coast line that it occupies should not be privatized for its purposes. Just as much as the fish should remain a public commons, so needs to be the environment in which that is grown. And the ownership is also really important for it to be owned by the community and for it to be on an appropriate scale and not be keeping fish in captivity in the way that we do pigs in captivity.
So you mentioned different kinds of aquaculture that weren't just about fin fish. And this question asks about reading an article about sustainable underwater gardens. Specifically one in Italy, and they're wondering, how does this idea pair with the future of sustainable fisheries and sustainable oceans?
You know, I think it's a great idea to have what they call multi-trophic fish farms, which is you're allowing for some natural return of that environment in some way. Some of it is forced, some of it is not. But this is not new. I'm always fascinated by ways that we come up with things these days and think that we've somehow have come up with something, but really this is an old age approach to fish farming. You look back at the indigenous people in Japan have been doing this, multi-trophic farming to make sure that the whole ecosystem is healthy. And so nothing wrong with coming up with something on your own and saying, this is really great. Yeah, let's do this. But we have to acknowledge that so much of this is passed on from generations and ancestors of many generations of many cultures of the past. And we have to acknowledge those ways. Otherwise, this becomes an innovation and the next shiny object that we all get attracted to. And as soon as there's some questions about its profitability or about whatever that we don't like, we lose sight of it. We put it on the back burner and we move on to the next shiny object. So let's learn from what the wisdom of the past has brought us, so that we can come up with these so-called innovations of today and make sure they're rooted in that and make sure we nurture them so that they don't become a hobby for a couple of years while we're paying attention to it and they become a way of life for generations to come.
Thank you for that. I think our next question, I'm going to try to combine two because they're kind of around the same topic. One is asking about offshore fish farms in Cargill.
I mentioned we were going to talk about that and I didn't. So good. I'm glad somebody asked.
Okay, someone wants to know. So Cargill offshore fish farms, and also someone just wants you to elaborate on Caterpillar. Like, what is that about with farming rights? Is it about equipment, manufacturing? So Cargill and Caterpillar, and relatedly, I think the private equity firms and just this, idea of control of the ocean spaces.
Yeah. I think at the core of all these three issues is these companies have found a way to capitalize on the ocean next. There are companies who are vertically integrated, who have this global reach. They're always prospecting. They're always looking for the next place where they can make money and where they can use their resources to further their resources even more. Caterpillar, in my opinion, I don't know the answer to it. Somebody should call Caterpillar and say, why did you buy those fishing rights back in 1995? What were you going to do with them? My guess is they recognized it was going to be wealth. You know, those fishing rights are going for, people have become millionaires literally overnight through the gift of fishing rights that they have accumulated somehow. So Caterpillar was smart in some ways, not the right kind of smart. I kind of cannibalistically smart, or whatever you want to call it, to identify, wow, this is going to be a way for us to bank some money. And they bought those fishing rights. They snapped them up. Same with the equity firm. You know, they're seeing it as a way to make money. This is fishing rights are now more valuable than the fish, than the seafood that we eat. And so these people are finding a way to capitalize on that. Cargill has a double whammy that they're interested in here. Not only is it a way to get some more financial resources, but Cargill has feed that they have been giving to factory farms on land that they now feel should be eaten by factory farms at sea. And so Cargill's operations, tearing down the Amazon to grow more soy to animals that are kept in conditions that they shouldn't be, they are leading a coalition, I forget the name of it, probably a good thing, of a national coalition that's pushing for industrial aquaculture offshore. And so because they have a feed that needs to be going somewhere at some point, they have to rationalize their existence. And so I think maybe in some ways that has something to do with our collective battle against factory farms, that we have limited some of their market maybe. But the fact that the American Soybean Association, the Illinois Soybean Association, and all these folks that are at the forefront of the fight to build offshore factory fish farms tells you something about the opportunity they see here, and tells us something about the opportunity afoot to really coalesce and fight them collectively, because the fight against the CAFO, the factory pig farm in Missouri, is the fight against the factory fish farm off the coast of California. Same fight, the same players, the same issues at the heart.
Thank you. Our next question says, there's been a little talk recently about lab-grown seafood. While still a long way off from being largely commercially accessible, is there any sense about what lab-grown fish meat being available would mean for the fishing rights and access?
You know, I find myself in a weird space with it. The little kid in me that used to watch the Star Treks of the world and think, oh, wow, it's so cool. They push this button and whatever they want materializes in front of them. It's like, whoa, this is what that's all about. I get it. And then the other part of me who sees the connection between the source of our food, the hands that touch it, the economic implications, the cultural implications, the systemic implications that has, that will all be affected by relinquishing all of those and putting them in a lab. So there is this weird thing of, is it a cool thing? Or is it going to be another way to isolate people even further and take away rights and minimize the role that people play in one of the most basic functions of humanity, which is eating? So when I balance those two things, the little kid in me gets pushed aside, and the more adult in me says, I can't go down that road. You know, I feel like the vibrancy of communities around the world depend on the holistic, truly sustainable approach to food, whether it's catching it, raising it, growing it, and then sharing it. None of that comes in a lab.
So this last question kind of relates to, you know, what do you do when you kind of disappoint that childhood you? How do you keep going with this work and fighting these fights? What keeps you going?
I get asked that question a lot. And I'm sure a lot of folks who are here get asked that question a lot, because the world feels really heavy these days, whether it's the events of last night in Michigan or elsewhere. It's not only the the heaviness of the work we do. It's also the heaviness of the events around the world that are happening. It's really easy to kind of get caught in it and not know how to get out of it. A few years ago, I guess the dime dropped for me that there is no other option. That little kid in me I don't see it as disappointed anymore. I kind of see it as, yeah, that was you before. This is me today. It's not about feeling badly about letting go of that little kid, but seeing it as a sign of maturity in myself. And then when it comes to kind of how can I have hope? How can you not have hope? I think that's really the thing that I take with me. And the people I work with, the people who lead the 2 organizations that I serve, hope is at the core of why they wake up every day. Whether it's when they throw their net in the water, put that seed in the ground, see that calf be born, whatever it is, there's an element of hope embedded in all of those things. If they are waking up every day with that, then what gives me a right not to? So it's really no other option.
Thank you. That's an important reminder for all of us, I think. Well, everyone in the chat and wherever you are, joining me in thanking Niaz, Dorry for an illuminating presentation, a reminder of all the kind of interconnections that are happening between the land and the sea in the fight for sustainability. We do have a poll or word cloud rather to end our session. So just a reminder, if you could place anything in the word cloud that reminded you of the presentation, the content, even how you're feeling right now, right? But any kind of relevant term or word is what we're looking for here. And we'll take a minute to let those responses come in. Okay, we're seeing, I was wondering if Poseidon would come up.
It did, I saw it.
Here he is. Blue revolution, privatization, interconnectedness.
Community.
I'm sure we're all kind of chewing on the caterpillar connections and privatization, especially overfishing, sovereignty, inspired, definitely inspiring. Great. Well, thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining us wherever you are, and we will see you next week.
Thank you.